You've probably noticed that the White Lotus has a very specific look. This latest season has taken it even further. This has a lot to do with the lenses it was shot on. Dune 2 also has a specific look, but probably not one you might compare with the White Lotus. But there is one major similarity. More on that later. The first 2 seasons of the White Lotus were shot on Alexa Minis with a variety of lenses. On the 3rd season, however, they switched formats entirely. Ben Kuchins shot the 1st season as well as the 3rd season, while the 2nd season was shot by Javier Grobet. Yet, the 3rd season looks quite different than the 1st, even though they were both shot by the same dude. The most important aspect of this new season to me is the observational, almost documentary style that Kuchins shot this season in. I think it is really exemplified by conversations in the show. There's a bias towards shooting from outside of the circle of the conversation, where most shots are on a long lens and shot over the shoulder of each of the performers. I'm sure part of this has something to do with shooting multicam and just the necessity of needing to be outside of the circle because you're avoiding a second camera that's shooting the other angle, but I could be wrong there. The most noticeable aspect of this season is the intensely shallow depth of field. I'm not always a fan of throwing the entire background out of focus. I think it can sometimes feel a little lazy, but in this instance, I understand the goal and purpose of doing so. That being said, I think it was sort of a shame that we couldn't really see these lovely environments that Mike White has placed the characters in this season. While it is absolutely a choice being made, I think sometimes it might go a little too far. Let's dive into what makes the White Lotus Season 3 look the way it does. This season was shot on Sony Venices with some funky old glass. To be specific, they used the Arri Rental Moviecam lenses. These things are so cool. They took the elements from Moviecam lenses from the 80s, which were made with donor glass from the 70s, and put them in these nice Arri Rental branded housings. They are LPL mount, which seems to be what Arri is really pushing lately, and have all these nice electronics that are so great for workflow when the camera knows what is being put in front of it. These lenses have such a lovely and smooth focus fall off. They're all a T2 except for the 100mm and the 135, which are both T2.8. Additionally, the 60mm goes down a full extra stop to a T1.5. I'd be willing to bet a lot of this show was shot on that 60. A T2 on a Super 35 sensor would not produce nearly as shallow a depth of field as we see here in Season 3. But because White and Kuchins decided to shoot large format, these lenses really produce that creamy fall off. I love doing really deep dives into lens choices by DPs. Really makes me think about my own lens choices while I'm shooting. So if these lenses have been around for so long, what else has been shot on them? You might think a lot has been shot on them, but maybe not. Through my research, I've had a really hard time finding much information about these lenses. And the reason I can't find a lot about these lenses is because even though the glass has existed since the 70s and then rehoused by Moviecam in the 80s, they've kind of sat on a shelf. And this is where Dune 2 comes in. Another spectacularly shot piece of media, but not really a film that someone would associate with the White Lotus. But Greg Fraser may be the suspect we're looking for. He chose to shoot on these same Moviecam lenses from Arri Rental, and this may really be the only link between Dune 2 and the White Lotus, which it's funny that there's a link at all. I couldn't find any cast or crew overlap between the two. Additionally, Dune Part 2 was shot on a mixture of Alexa LF and Mini LFs, as well as some Alexa 65. So they used Arri's large format cameras rather than Sony's Venice, which is also large format. And that's something that I find really interesting about this industry. You can draw these cool threads through works via these strangely specific technical elements. I found an article talking about how Greg Fraser actually had a hand in the creation of these new age of vintage large format lenses. This could be a grain of salt situation, but according to this article on sportsvideo.org of all places, a conversation with him inspired the Arri Alphas and Moviecam lenses, both of these being large format, meaning in prosumer talk, they cover a full frame camera sensor. The alphas are anamorphics while the Moviecams are spherical. The new age cinematographer's desire for vintage optics has spurred these creations by Arri Rental. Since Arri purchased Moviecam back in the 90s, mostly for their camera technology, which they used on a few of their film cameras back in the day, they didn't really do much with the lenses Moviecam had been making until the 2020s, actually. I find this so cool and interesting to just sit on these lovely old optics for all these years. It's so fascinating because, like, you have these wonderful old lenses, but no one really wanted old glass until somewhat recently. The way the industry had been building look-wise to this point, everyone wanted clean glass so that they could control every aspect until really relatively recently. The other really cool thing about these lenses, which make them perfect for the look of Dune 2, are their incorporation of LDA chips for efficient lens data workflows, making them suitable even for VFX heavy productions. This comes especially handy for Dune 2, well, less so for the White Lotus, but of course still very handy to have that data being relayed on set, especially when running multicam setups. To be able to broadcast what focal length is on each camera to the DIT station, the director's monitors, ACs, handsets, etc., etc., etc. Very useful for a multitude of reasons, and just to eliminate the need for some communication about what's going on set. It's all about saving time. What's really interesting is when you think about it, there are some visual similarities between Dune 2 and the White Lotus. One wouldn't typically compare a huge sci-fi movie and a reverse murder mystery show. Yet here I am. Very rad.
I also just briefly want to comment on the light of this show, because it's such a great example of how much effort goes into just lighting a background. And we already know that Kutchins is throwing the entire background out of focus, but then look at these lighting diagrams that I pulled from an interview with the gaffer of the White Lotus. Look at how many fixtures he's using just to light these simple backgrounds of these shots that's literally going to be mostly out of focus. It's just crazy to me, and I love it when these diagrams get released to the public to look at, because I can just analyze how much effort goes into the looks of these shows at the top level, and it's so interesting. He also comments on how many fixtures went into the shooting of this show, at least in terms of sky panels.
To eliminate the huts and the trees around there, we used S60s. We had like 50 or 70 of them. They have one private residency which has an elevated tower, like a terrace, and we were allowed to place 118K. And this was our main moonlight.
Additionally, the fact that he purchased 10 sky panel X's because he couldn't find any in Thailand, that's insane. That's just insane.
In Bangkok, I think there was no Sky X available, so I bought 10 of them, and Arri was helping me out on that site to make it happen to ship them to Thailand.
Okay, I'm going to go on a little tangent here about another aspect of the White Lotus that kind of has nothing to do with Dune 2, and you're just going to have to bear with me. But there's one zoom shot, and I'm fairly certain that it's the only zoom the entire season. It occurs in episode 4. It is sort of the first time most of them are leaving the resort, and they're introduced to the real world, at least in the show, through this crazy zoom. It is sort of beautiful and interesting how these types of shows will rent a whole huge zoom and controllers and all of the support needed to do all that just for a single shot. And especially when most of the show is shot on prime, because you gotta completely re-rig a camera just to shoot this one shot. But I respect the dedication to vision, and obviously I think it's really cool and excellent. Story-wise, it sort of jarringly interrupts the rest of the show, which plays really well here. Like, the whole show is just these talking interactions, which never really get boring to me because I just dive into the texture of the out of focus parts of the scene, but it is sort of intentionally stagnant, which might be just in service of shooting so wide open for most of the show. Regardless, this shot is so crazy in the context of how the rest of the show is shot. It feels really out of place in a cool way, but that makes perfect sense. look how out of place this American family looks out and about in Thailand. So thinking about it that way, it works perfectly to serve the story. And that's something I think is a really common theme through the whole show. I feel like all of these things I've talked about do nothing but serve the story. I see a lot of complaints online about the shallow depth of field of this season, and I'll be honest, through the first couple of episodes I would have agreed with them, but the way the season progressed, I slowly started to really understand why they chose to shoot the way they did. And this is coming from someone who really appreciates a good deep focus. I mean, I love a deep focus. Just show me everything. Show me the set design. Let me look at everything. Also, if the story is good, I won't have to look at everything, but I digress. But here it makes sense. These people are all trapped in their own individual La La Lands. Everyone involved this season, and others for that matter, are problematic in their own wealthy ways. And they are all on their narrow path without much care or concern for people outside of their little bubbles. And for that, this look, I think, works really well. But it is just really interesting to me how this line can be drawn between Dune 2 and the White Lotus. And that's a beautiful thing. I hope you've enjoyed today's tangent of a video, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.